one of the failure modes of empathy is our susceptibility to anecdotal data. Just a good story
Yeah.
will get us to not think clearly. But what about empathy in the context of just discussing ideas with other people? And then there's a large number of people, like in this country, red and blue, half the population believes certain things on immigration or on the response to the pandemic or any kind of controversial issue. Even if the election was fairly executed, having an empathy for their worldview, trying to understand where they're coming from,
Mm.
not just in the explicit statement of their idea, but the entirety of like the roots from which their idea stems. That kind of empathy while you're discussing ideas, what is in your pursuit of truth, having empathy for the perspective of a large number of other people versus raw mathematical reason.
I think it's important, but it only takes you so far, right? It doesn't get you to truth, right? Truth is not it's not decided by democratic principles, and um, certain people believe things for understandable reasons, but those reasons are nonetheless bad reasons, right? They don't scale, they don't generalize, they're not reasons anyone should adopt for themselves or respect, epistemologically, and yet their circumstance is understandable and it's something you can care about, right? And so yeah, like I mean, just take. I think there's many examples of this that you might be thinking of, but I mean, one that comes to mind is I've been super critical of Trump, obviously, and I've been super critical of certain people for endorsing him or not criticizing him when he really made it, patently obvious who he was. If there had been any doubt initially, there was no doubt when we have a sitting president who's not agreeing to a peaceful transfer of power, right? So um, I'm critical of all of that, and yet the fact that many millions of Americans didn't see what was wrong with Trump or bought into the didn't see through his con, right? I mean, they bought into the idea that he was a brilliant businessman who might just be able to change things because he's so unconventional and so, his heart is in the right place. He's really a man of the people, even though he's a gold plated everything in his life. Um, they bought the myth somehow of largely because they had seen him on television for almost a decade and a half, pretending to be this genius businessman who could get things done. Um, it's understandable to me that many very frustrated people who have not had their hopes and dreams actualized, who have been the victims of globalism and many other current trends, uh, it's understandable that they would be confused and not see the liability of electing a grossly incompetent, morbidly narcissistic person into the presidency. So I don't. So which is to say that I don't blame. There are many many millions of people who I don't necessarily blame for the Trump phenomenon. But I can nonetheless bemoan the phenomenon as indicative of very bad state of affairs in our society, right? So it's there's two levels to it. I mean, one is I think you have to call a spade when you're talking about how things actually work and what things are likely to happen or not. But then you can recognize that people have very different life experiences and yeah, I mean, I think empathy and probably the better word for what I would hope to embody there is compassion, right? Like really, to really wish people well, and to really wish strangers well, effortlessly wish them well. I mean, to realize that there is no opposition between at bottom. There's no real opposition between selfishness and selflessness because wise selfishness really takes into account other people's happiness. I mean, which do you want to live in a society where you have everything, but most other people have nothing? Or do you want to live in a society where you're surrounded by happy, creative, self-actualized people who are having their hopes and dreams realized. I think it's obvious that the second society is much better, however much you can guard your good luck.
But what about having empathy for certain principles that people believe? For example, the pushback, the other perspective on this, because you said bought the myth of Trump as the great businessman. There could be a lot of people that are supporters of Trump who could say that Sam Harris bought the myth that we have this government of the people by the people that actually represents the people, as
Mm.
opposed to a bunch of elites who are running a giant bureaucracy that is corrupt, that is feeding themselves, and they're actually not representing the people. And then here's this chaos agent, Trump,
Mm.
who speaks off the top of his head. Yeah, he's flawed in all this number of ways. He's a more comedian than he is a presidential type of figure. And he's actually creating the kind of chaos that's going to shake up this bureaucracy, shake up the elites that are so uncomfortable because they don't want the world to know about the game they got running on everybody else. So that's
Yeah,
that's a kind of
yeah,
perspective that they would take and say, yeah, there's these flaws that Trump has, but
yeah.
this is necessary.
I agree with the first part. So I haven't bought the myth that it's a truly representative democracy in the way that we would might idealize. And on some level, I mean, this is a different conversation, but on some level, I'm not even sure how much I think it should be. Right? Like I'm not sure uh, we want in the end everyone's opinion given equal weight about just what we should do about anything, and I include myself in that. I mean, there are many topics around which I don't deserve to have a strong opinion because I don't know what I'm talking about, right? Or what I would be talking about if I had a strong opinion. So, um, and I think we'll probably get to that, to some of those topics, because I've declined to have certain conversations on my podcast just because I think I'm the wrong person to have that conversation, right? And it's and I think it's important to see those bright lines in one's life and in the moment politically and ethically. So yeah, I think. So leave aside the viability of democracy. But I'm under no illusions that all of our institutions are worth preserving precisely as they have been up until the moment this great orange wrecking ball came swinging through our lives. But it was a very bad bet to elect someone who is grossly incompetent and worse than incompetent. Um, Genuinely malevolent in his selfishness, right? And this is something we know based on literally decades of him being in the public eye, right? He's not a public servant in any normal sense of that term, and he couldn't possibly give an honest or sane answer to the question you asked me about empathy and reason and like how should we what should guide us. Um, I genuinely think he is missing some necessary moral and psychological tools, right? And this is I can feel compassion for him as a human being because I think having those things is incredibly important, and genuinely loving other people is incredibly important, and knowing what all that's about is that's really the good stuff in life. And I think he's missing a lot of that. But I think we don't want to promote people to the highest positions of power in our society who are far outliers in pathological terms, right? We want them to be far outliers in if in the best case in wisdom and compassion and some of the topics you've brought up. I mean, we want someone to be deeply informed. We want someone to be um, uh, unusually curious, unusually alert to how they may be wrong or getting things wrong consequentially. He's none of those things. And if insofar as we're going to get normal mediocrities in that role, which I think is often the best we could expect, let's get normal mediocrities in that role, not once in a generation narcissists and frauds. I mean, it's like I mean, just take honesty as a single variable, right? I think you want, yeah, yes, it's possible that most politicians lie at least some of the time. I don't think that's a good thing. I think people should be generally honest, even to a fault. Um, yes, there are certain circumstances where lying, I think, is necessary. It's kind of on a continuum of self-defense and violence. So it's like if you're going to, if the Nazis come to your door and ask you if you've got Anne Frank in the attic, I think it's okay to lie to them. But Trump, arguably there's never been a person that anyone could name in human history who's lied with that kind of velocity. I mean, he was just a blizzard of lies, great and small, to pointless and effective. But it's just it it says something uh, fairly alarming about our society that a person of that character got promoted. And so, yes, I have compassion and concern for half of the society who didn't see it that way, and that's going to sound elitist and smug or something for anyone who's on that side listening to me. But it's genuine. I mean, I understand that like I barely have I'm like one of the luckiest people in the world, and I barely have the bandwidth to pay attention to half the things I should pay attention to in order to have an opinion about half the things we're going to talk about, right? So how much less bandwidth is somebody who's working two jobs, or a single mom who's raising multiple kids, even a single kid. It's unimaginable to me that people have the bandwidth to really track this stuff. And so then they jump on social media and they get inundated by misinformation, and they see what their favorite influencer just said. And now they're worried about vaccines, and we're living in an environment where the information space has become so corrupted, and we've built machines to further corrupt it. I mean, we've built a business model for the internet that further corrupts it. So it is just it's chaos in informational terms, and I don't fault people for being confused and impatient and at their wits' end. And yes, Trump was an enormous fuck you to the establishment, and that was understandable for many reasons.
To me, Sam Harris, the great Sam Harris, is somebody I've looked up to for a long time as a beacon, a voice of reason. And there's this meme on the internet, and I would love you to steel man the case for it and against, that Trump broke Sam Harris's brain. That there's something is disproportionately to the actual impact that Trump had on our society. He had an impact on the ability of balanced, calm, rational minds to see the world clearly, to think clearly. You being one of the beacons of that. Right. Is there a degree to which he broke your brain? Otherwise known as Trump derangement syndrome.
Yeah.
medical condition.
I mean, I think Trump derangement syndrome is a very clever meme because it just throws the problem back on the person who's criticizing Trump. But
sure.
In truth, the true Trump derangement syndrome was not to have seen how dangerous and divisive it would be to promote someone like Trump to that position of power, and to not, and in the final moment, not to see how untenable it was to still support someone who, a sitting president who was not committing to a peaceful transfer of power. I mean, that was if that wasn't a bright line for you, you have been deranged by something, because that was, that was 1 minute to midnight for our democracy, as far as I'm concerned. And I think it really was, but for the integrity of a few people, that we didn't suffer some real constitutional crisis and real emergency, after January 6th. I mean, if Mike Pence had caved in and decided to not certify the election, right? Literally, you can count on two hands the number of people who held things together at that moment, and it wasn't for want of trying on Trump's part that we didn't succumb to some real, truly uncharted catastrophe with our democracy. So the fact that didn't happen is not a sign that those of us who were worried that it was so close to happening were exaggerating the problem. I mean, it's like, you almost got run over by a car, but you didn't. And so, you're the fact that you're adrenalized and you're thinking, but boy, that was dangerous. I probably shouldn't, wander in the middle of the street with my eyes closed. You weren't wrong to feel that you really had a problem, right? Um, and came very close to something truly terrible. So I think that's where we were, and I think we shouldn't do that again, right? So the fact that he's coming back around as potentially a viable candidate, I'm not spending much time thinking about it, frankly, because it's I'm waiting for the moment where it requires some thought. I mean, it took up. I don't know how many podcasts I devoted to the topic. It wasn't that. I mean, it wasn't that many in the end. Against the number of podcasts I devoted to other topics, but there are people who look at Trump and just find him funny, entertaining, not especially threatening. He's like not a it's just good fun to see somebody who's just not taking anything seriously and is just putting a stick in the wheel of business as usual again and again and again and again. Um, and they don't really see anything much at stake, right? It doesn't really matter if we don't support NATO. It doesn't really matter if he says he trusts Putin more than our intelligence services. I mean, none of this it doesn't matter if he's on the one hand saying that he loves uh, the leader of North Korea, and on the other threatens to bomb them back to the Stone Age, right, on Twitter. It all can be taken in the spirit of kind of reality television. It's like this is the part of the movie that's just fun to watch, right? And I understand that. I can even inhabit that space for a few minutes at a time, but there's the deeper concern that we're in the process of entertaining ourselves to death, right? That we're just not taking things seriously. And it's a problem I've had with several other people we might name who just appear to me to be goofing around at scale, and they lack a kind of moral seriousness. I mean, they're touching big problems where lives hang in the balance, but they're just fucking around. And I think they're really important problems that we have to get our heads straight around. And we need, it's not to say that institutions don't become corrupt. I think they do, and and I'm quite worried that, both about the loss of trust in our institutions and the fact that trust has eroded for good reason, right? That they have become less trustworthy. I think they've become infected by political ideologies that are not truth tracking. I mean, I worry about all of that, but I just think we need institutions. We need to rebuild them. We need experts who are real experts. We need to value expertise over amateurish speculation and conspiracy thinking and just and bullshit.
The kind of amateur speculation we're doing on this very podcast.
I'm usually alert to the moments where I'm just guessing or where I actually feel like I'm talking from within my wheelhouse. And I try to telegraph that a fair amount with people. So yeah, I mean, but it's not, it's different. Like, I mean, you can invite someone onto your podcast who's an expert about something that you're not an expert about. And then you in the process of getting more informed yourself, your audience is getting more informed. So you're asking smart questions, and you might be pushing back at the margins, but you know that when push comes to shove on that topic, you really don't have a basis to have a strong opinion. And if you were going to form a strong opinion that was this counter to the expert you have in front of you, it's going to be by deference to some other expert who you've brought in or who you've heard about or whose work you've read or whatever. But there's a paradox to how we value authority in science that most people don't understand. And I think we should at some point unravel that, because it's the basis for a lot of public confusion. And frankly, it's the basis for a lot of criticism I've received on these topics, where it's people think that I'm I'm against free speech, or I'm an establishment shill, or it's like I just think I'm a credentialist. I just think people with PhDs from Ivy League universities should run everything. It's not true, but there's a ton of there's a lot to cut through to get to daylight there, because people are um, very confused about how we value authority in the service of rationality generally.
You've talked about it, but it's just interesting the intensity of feeling you have. You've had this famous phrase about Hunter Biden and children in the basement. Can you just revisit this case? So let me give another perspective on the situation of January 6th and Trump in general. It's possible that January 6th and things of that nature revealed that our democracy is actually pretty fragile, and that Trump is not a malevolent and ultra competent malevolent figure, but is simply a jokester. And he just, by creating the chaos, revealed that it's all pretty fragile.
Mm.
Because you're a student of history, and there's a lot of people like Vladimir Lenin, Hitler, who are exceptionally competent at controlling power, at being executives and taking that power, controlling the generals, controlling all the figures involved, and certainly not tweeting, but working in the shadows behind the scenes to gain power. And they did so extremely competently, and that is how they were able to gain power. The pushback with Trump, he was doing none of that. He was creating what he's very good at, creating drama, sometimes for humor's sake, sometimes for drama's sake, and simply revealed that our democracy is fragile. And so he's not this once in a generation horrible figure.
Once in a generation narcissist. No, I don't think he's a truly scary, sinister, Putin-like, or Hitler, much less Hitler-like figure. Not at all. I mean, he's not ideological. He doesn't care about anything beyond himself. So it's not. No, he's much less scary than any really scary, totalitarian, right? I mean, and he's
more Brave New World than 1984.
This is what Eric Weinstein never stops badgering me about, but he's still wrong, Eric. I can, my analogy for Trump was that he's an evil Chauncey Gardner. I don't know if you remember the book or the film Being There, with Peter Sellers. But Peter Sellers is this Gardner who really doesn't know anything, but he gets recognized as this wise man and gets promoted to immense power in Washington, because he's speaking in these kind of in a semblance of wisdom. He's got these very simple aphorisms, or what seem to be aphorisms. He's just talking. All he cares about is gardening. He's just talking about his garden all the time.
Yeah.
But he'll say something. But in the spring, the new shoots will bloom, and people read into that some kind of genius, insight politically, and so he gets promoted. And so that's the joke of the film. For me, Trump has always been someone like an evil Chauncey Gardner. I mean, he's. It's not to say he's totally. Yes, he has a certain kind of genius. He's got a genius for creating a spectacle around himself. Right? He's got a genius for getting the eye of the media always coming back to him. But it's a kind of self-promotion that only works if you actually are truly shameless and don't care about having a reputation for anything that I or you would want to have a reputation for, right? It's like the pure pornography of attention, right? He just wants more of it. I think the truly depressing and genuinely scary thing was that we have a country that, at least half of the country, given how broken our society is in many ways, we have a country that didn't see anything wrong with that. Bringing someone who obviously doesn't know what he should know to be president, and who's obviously not a good person, right? Obviously doesn't care about people, can't even pretend to care about people really, right? In a credible way. And so, I mean, if there's a silver lining to this, it's along the lines you just sketched. It shows us how vulnerable our system is to a truly brilliant and sinister figure, right? I mean, like, I think we really dodged a bullet. Yes, someone far more competent and conniving and ideological could have exploited our system in a way that Trump didn't. And that's yeah. So if we plug those holes eventually, that would be a good thing, and he would have done a good thing for our society, right? I mean, one of the things we realized, and I think nobody knew. I mean, I certainly didn't know it, and I didn't hear anyone talk about it. Is how much our system relies on norms rather than laws,
Yeah, civility
right?
almost.
Yeah, it's just like it's quite possible that he never did anything illegal. Truly illegal. I think he probably did a few illegal things, but like illegal such that he really should be thrown in jail for it. Um, at least that remains to be seen. So all of the chaos, all of the all of the diminishment of our stature in the world, all of the opportunity costs of spending years focused on nonsense, um, all of that was just norm violations. All of that was just all a matter of not saying the thing you should say. But that doesn't mean they're insignificant, right? It's not that it's not illegal for a sitting president to say, no, I'm not going to commit to a peaceful transfer of power, right? We'll wait and see whether I win. If I win, it was the election was valid. If I lose, it was fraudulent, right?
But aren't those humorous perturbations to our system of civility such that we know what the limits are, and now we start to think that and have these kinds of discussions?
But that wasn't a humorous perturbation because he did everything he could. Granted, he wasn't very competent, but he did everything he could to try to steal the election. I mean, the irony is he claimed to have an election stolen from him, all the while doing everything he could to steal it, declaring it fraudulent in advance, trying to get the votes to not be counted as the evening wore on, knowing that they were going to be disproportionately Democrat votes because of because of the position he took on mail-in ballots. I mean, all of it was fairly calculated. The whole circus of the clown car that crashed into Four Seasons Landscaping, right? And you got Rudy Giuliani with his hair dye, and you got Sidney Powell, and all these grossly incompetent people lying as freely as they could breathe about election fraud, right? And all of these things are getting thrown out by largely Republican election officials and Republican judges. It wasn't for want of trying that he didn't maintain his power in this country. He really tried to steal the presidency. He just was not competent, and the people around him weren't competent. So that's a good thing, and it's worth not letting that happen again.
But he wasn't competent, so he didn't do everything he could.
Well, no, he did everything he could. He didn't do everything that could have been done by someone more competent.
Right, but the tools you have as a president, you could do a lot of things. You can declare emergencies, especially during COVID. You could postpone the election.
Right.
You can create military conflict. That any kind of reason to postpone the election. There's a lot of ways.
But he tried to do things, and he would have to have done those things through other people. And there are people who refused to do those things. There are people who said they would quit. They would quit publicly, right? I mean, you start again. There are multiple books written about the last hours of this presidency, and the details are shocking in what he tried to do and tried to get others to do, and it's awful, right? I mean, it's just awful that we were that close to something, to a true unraveling of our political process. I mean, it's the only time in our lifetime that anything like this has happened, and it was deeply embarrassing, right? For on the world stage, it's just like we looked like a banana republic there for a while, and we're the lone superpower. It's not good, right? And so we shouldn't the people who thought, well, we just need to shake things up, and this is a great way to shake things up, and having people storm our Capitol and smear shit on the walls. That's just more shaking things up, right? It's all just for the lulls. There's a nihilism and cynicism to all of that, which, again, in certain people, it's understandable. Frankly, it's not understandable if you've got $1 billion and you're, have a compound in Menlo Park or wherever. It's like there are people who are cheerleading this stuff who shouldn't be cheerleading this stuff, and who know that they can get on their Gulfstream and fly to their compound in New Zealand if everything goes to shit, right? So there's a cynicism to all of that I think we should be deeply critical of.
But what I'm trying to understand is not and analyze is not the behavior of this particular human being, but the effect it had in part on the division between people. And to
Yeah.
me, the degree, the meme of Sam Harris's brain being broken by Trump represents you're like the person I would look to bridge the division.
Well, I don't think there is something profitably to be said to someone who's truly captivated by the personality cult of Trumpism, right? Like, there's nothing that I'm going to say to. There's no conversation I'm going to have with Candace Owens, say, about Trump that's going to converge on something reasonable, right?
You don't think so?
No, I mean, I haven't tried with Candace, but I've tried with many people who are in that particular orbit. I mean, I've had conversations with people who won't admit that there's anything wrong with Trump, anything.
So I'd like to push for the empathy versus reason. Because when you operate in the space of reason, yes. But I think there's a lot of power in you, Sam Harris, showing that you're willing to see the good qualities of Trump, publicly showing that. I think that's the way to win over the Candace
But he has so
Owenses.
few of them. He has fewer good
But,
qualities than virtually anyone I can name, right?
but
So he's funny. I'll grant you that he's funny. He's a good entertainer.
there's others. Look at just policies and actual impacts he had.
I've admitted that. No. So I've admitted that many of his policies I agree with. Many of his policies. I mean, so probably more often than not, I mean, at least on balance, I agreed. So I agreed with his policy that we should take China seriously as an adversary, right? I think, I mean, again, you have to. There's a lot of fine print to a lot of this because the way he talks about these things and many of his motives that are obvious are things that I don't support. But I mean, take immigration. I think it's obvious that we should have control of our borders, right? Like, I don't see the argument for not having control of our borders. We should let in who we want to let in, and we should keep out who we want to keep out, and we should have a sane immigration policy. So I didn't necessarily think it was a priority to build the wall, but I never criticized the impulse to build the wall, because if tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are coming across that border and we are not in a position to know who's coming, that seems untenable to me. So, and I can recognize that many people in our society are, on balance, the victims of immigration, because and there is in many cases a zero sum contest between the interests of actual citizens and the interests of immigrants, right? So, I think we should have control of our borders. We should have a sane and compassionate immigration policy. We should let in refugees, right? So Trump on refugees was terrible, but no, like I would say 80% of the policy concerns people celebrated in him are concerns that I either share entirely or certainly sympathize with, right? So, like, that's not the issue. The issue is,
A threat to democracy in some fundamental way.
the issue is largely what you said it was. It's not so much the person; it's the effect on everything he touches, right? He has this superpower of deranging and destabilizing almost everything he touches, and sullying and compromising the integrity of almost anyone who comes into his orbit. I mean, so you looked at these people who served, as his chief of staff or in various cabinet positions, people who had real reputations, for probity and level-headedness. Whether you shared their politics or not. I mean, these were real people. These were not, some of them were goofballs, but many people who just got totally trashed by proximity to him, and then trashed by him when they finally parted company with him. Yeah, I mean, there's just people bent over backwards to accommodate his norm violations, and it was bad for them, and it was bad for our system. But none of that discounts the fact that we have a system that really needs a proper house cleaning. Yes, there are bad incentives and entrenched interests, and yeah, I'm not a fan of the concept of the deep state, but because it has been so propagandized. But yes, there's something like that, that is not flexible enough to respond intelligently to the needs of the moment, right? So there's a lot of rethinking of government and of institutions in general that I think we should do, but we need smart, well-informed, well-intentioned people to do that job. And the well-intentioned part is hugely important, right? It's just give me someone who is not the most selfish person anyone has ever heard about in their lifetime, right? And what we got with Trump was literally the one most selfish person I think anyone could name. I mean, and again, there's so much known about this man. That's the thing. It's like it predates his presidency. We knew this guy 30 years ago, and this is what, to come back to those inflammatory comments about Hunter Biden's laptop. The reason why I can say with confidence that I don't care what was on his laptop is that there is, and that includes any evidence of corruption on the part of his father. Right now, there's been precious little of that that's actually emerged. So it's like there is no, as far as I can tell, there's not a big story associated with that laptop, as much as people bang on about a few emails. But even if there were just obvious corruption, right? Like Joe Biden was at this meeting and he took, this amount of money from this shady guy for bad reasons, right? Given how visible the lives of these two men have been, right? I mean, given how much we know about Joe Biden and how much we know about Donald Trump and how they have lived in public for almost as long as I've been alive, both of them, the scale of corruption can't possibly balance out between the two of them, right? If you show me that Joe Biden has this secret life where he's driving a Bugatti and he's living like Andrew Tate, right, and he's doing all these things I didn't know about, okay, then I'm going to start getting a sense that, all right, maybe this guy is way more corrupt than I realized. Maybe there is some deal in Ukraine or with China that is just like, this guy is not who he seems. He's not the public servant he's been pretending to be. He's been on the take for decades and decades, and he's as dirty as can be. He's all mobbed up, and it's a nightmare. And he can't be trusted, right? That's possible if you show me that his life is not at all what it seems. But on the assumption that having looked at this guy for literally decades, right, and knowing that every journalist has looked at him for decades, just how many affairs is he having? Just how much, how many drugs is he doing? How many houses does he have? Where, what are the obvious conflicts of interest? You hold that against what we know about Trump, right? And I mean, the litany of indiscretions you can put on Trump's side that testify to his personal corruption, to testify to the fact that he has no ethical compass. There's simply no comparison, right? So that's why I don't care about what's on the laptop. Now, if you tell me Trump is no longer running for president in 2024, and we can put Trumpism behind us, and now you're saying, listen, there's a lot of stuff on that laptop that makes Joe Biden look like a total asshole. Okay, I'm all ears, right? I mean, it was in 2020, it was a forced choice between a sitting president who wouldn't commit to a peaceful transfer of power and a guy who's obviously too old to be president, who has a crack-addicted son, who lost his laptop, and I just knew that I was going to take Biden in spite of whatever litany of horrors was going to come tumbling out of that laptop.
And that might involve so the actual quote is, Hunter Biden literally could have had the corpses of children in the basement there's a dark humor to it, right? Which is, I think you speak to. I would not have cared. There's nothing. It's Hunter Biden. It's not Joe Biden. Whatever the scope of Joe Biden's corruption is, it is infinitesimally compared to the corruption we know Trump was involved in. It's like a firefly to the sun, is what you're speaking to. But let me make
Hmm.
the case that you're really focused on the surface stuff, that it's possible to have corruption that masquerades in the thing we mentioned, which is civility. You can spend hundreds of billions of dollars or trillions towards the war uh, in the Middle East, for example,
Hmm.
something that you've changed your mind on in terms of the negative impact it has on the world. And that, the military industrial complex, everybody's very nice. Everybody's very civil. It's very upfront. Here's how
Hmm.
we're spending the money. Yeah, it sometimes somehow disappears in different places, but that's the way. War is complicated, and everyone is very polite. There's no coke and strippers or whatever is on the laptop. It's very nice and polite. In the meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of civilians die. Hate, just an incredible amount of hate is created because
Hmm.
people lose their family members, all that kind of stuff. But there's no strippers and coke on a laptop.
Yeah,
So,
but it's not just superficial. It is when someone only wants wealth and power and fame. That is their objective function, right? They're like a robot that is calibrated just to those variables, right? And they don't care about the risks we run on any other front. They don't care about, I mean, environmental risk, pandemic risk, nuclear proliferation risk, none of it, right? They're just tracking fame and money and whatever can personally redound to their self-interest along those lines. And they're not informed about the other risks we're running, really. I mean, in Trump, you had a president who was repeatedly asking his generals, why couldn't we use our nuclear weapons? Why can't we have more of them? Why do I have fewer nuclear weapons than JFK? Right, as though that were a sign of anything other than progress, right? Um, and this is the guy who's got the button, right? I mean, somebody's following him around with a bag, waiting to take his order to launch, right? Um, that is a it's a risk we should never run. One thing Trump has going for him, I think, is that he doesn't drink or do drugs, right? Although there's people allege that he does speed, but um, let's take him at his word. He's not deranging himself with pharmaceuticals, at least. But apart from Diet Coke, but
there's nothing wrong. Just for the record, let me push back on that. There's nothing
nothing
wrong
wrong
with
with Diet
Diet
Coke.
Coke.
Yeah,
I've been consuming a very large
I
amount. So
occasionally have some myself. But
there's no scientific evidence that I observed the negatives of all those studies
right.
about aspartame and all of that. No, I don't know.
I hope you're right.
I hope so
Um,
too.
yeah, I mean everything you said about the military-industrial complex is true, right? And we've been worrying about that on both sides of the aisle for a very long time. I mean, that's just that phrase came from Eisenhower. Um, it's I mean, so much of what ails us is a story of bad incentives, right? And bad incentives are so powerful that they corrupt even good people, right? How much more do they corrupt bad people, right? Like, so it's like you want, at minimum, you want reasonably good people, at least non-pathological people in the system trying to navigate against the grain of bad incentives. And better still, all of us can get together and try to diagnose those incentives and change them, right? And we will really succeed when we have a system of incentives where the good incentives are so strong that even bad people are effortlessly behaving as though they're good people because they're so successfully incentivized to behave that way, right? That's and so it's almost the inversion of our current situation. So yes, and you say I changed my mind about the war. I Not quite. I mean, I was never a supporter of the war in Iraq. I was always worried that it was a distraction from the war in Afghanistan. I was a supporter of the war in Afghanistan, and I will admit, in hindsight, that looks like at best a highly ambiguous and painful exercise, more likely a fool's errand, right? It's like that would, it did not turn out well. It wasn't for want of trying. I don't, I have not done a deep dive on all of the failures there. And maybe all of these failures are failures in principle. I mean, maybe that's not the kind of thing that can be done well by anybody, whatever our intentions. But yeah, the move to Iraq always seemed questionable to me. And when we knew the problem, the immediate problem at that moment, Al Qaeda uh, uh, was in Afghanistan, and and then bouncing to Pakistan. Um, anyway, so yes, but my sense of the possibility of nation building, my sense of insofar as the neocon um, spirit of responsibility and idealism, that America was the kind of nation that should be functioning in this way as the world's cop, and we have to get in there and untangle some of these knots by force rather often, because if we don't do it over there, we're going to have to do it over here, kind of thing. Yeah, some of that has definitely changed for me in my thinking. I mean, there are obviously cultural reasons why it failed in Afghanistan, and if you can't change the culture, it's you're not going to force a change at gunpoint in the culture, or it certainly seems that that's not going to happen. And it took us, over 20 years to realize that.
That's one of the things you realize with the wars. There's not going to be a strong signal that things are not working. You can just keep pouring money into a thing, a military effort.
Well, also there are signs of it working too. You have all the stories of girls now going to school, right? The girls are getting battery acid thrown in their faces by religious maniacs. And then we come in there and we stop that. And now girls are getting educated, and and that's all good. And our intentions are good there. And I mean, we're on the right side of history there. Good girls should be going to school. Malala Yousafzai should have the Nobel Prize, and she shouldn't have been shot in the face by the Taliban, right? We know what the right answers are there. The question is, what do you do when there are enough, in this particular case, religious maniacs who are willing to die and let their children die in defense of crazy ideas and moral norms that belong in the 7th century? And it's a problem we couldn't solve, and we couldn't solve it even though we spent trillions of dollars to solve it.